So, what structures in the brain are actually processing the experience of emotion? There are many structures that are active, and those structures belong to something called the limbic system, also known as the emotional brain. The limbic system is a series of structures, and these structures are nuclei, mostly located in the medial portion of the two hemispheres, so in between the left and the right hemisphere, but also includes part of the prefrontal cortex, and it's arranged around the brainstem. So the limbic system is organized into many different feedback systems that monitor emotions and mood, present and past experiences, and memory, and the emotional tone of the current setting. So the limbic system is this finely tuned, balanced system that runs on neurotransmitters and communicates with excitation and inhibition. So any disruption of those feedback systems, those feedback loops, by injury or damage in part of the brain or in neurotransmitter balance can result in dysfunction in those feedback loops, which can result in mental illness. So let's take a look at those limbic system structures. So probably the most well-known structure is the amygdala. And it's named after the word for the almond because it appears to be shaped like one, or at least it did for the person who named it. And it's composed of many, many nuclei that are important in helping us determine the emotional significance of things in our environment. It's thought to be very important in evaluating the potential for anything in our environment to be rewarding or punishing. And it has been shown to be critical in the processing of emotions and emotional memory, and especially in the experience of fear. Near the amygdala is the thalamus. And the thalamus is that part of the brain where incoming sensory and motor information goes first. The word thalamus means anteroom. It's like the first room, the first place where sensory information comes into the brain. And then from that point, it gets sent to different parts of the cortex and other parts of the brain for more processing. One of the places the information is sent is to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is located just below the thalamus, and it's involved in the 4 F's: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproductive behavior. And it synthesizes and releases neurotransmitters that are crucially involved in these feedback structures in the limbic system. In monitoring mood and arousal, it also controls the autonomic nervous system and autonomic nervous system responses like the fight or flight response and the parasympathetic response, which is the calm and relax response. Another structure that is important is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is located on the medial portion of each temporal lobe, so the inside of each temporal lobe. And it's thought to be involved in forming new memories and also storing and retrieving memory. Also, it integrates memory with sensory input, with smell, sight, touch, hearing, taste, and emotional tone. This is why the smell of cinnamon candles during the holidays gives you that nice, warm feeling. It works with the amygdala, and it also determines whether various stimuli in the environment are going to be rewarding and punishing, and helps to mark them in memory. Another structure is the fornix, and the fornix is a connection between the hippocampus and the mammillary bodies, so that output from the hippocampus travels through the fornix to the mammillary bodies. Those mammillary bodies are important in episodic memory, remembering events, people, etc., your autobiographical memory, like your first kiss. The cingulate gyrus, or the cingulate cortex, is located just above the corpus callosum, and it's believed to combine emotional, attentional, and bodily information about consciousness and conscious emotional experience. It's also thought to be important in OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So the cingulate gyrus can be divided into the anterior and the posterior cingulate gyrus. Next is the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is involved in executive functions, and I'll talk about those more shortly. So just to focus on a couple of the most important structures, the amygdala, as I mentioned, it plays a role in fear especially, and in anxiety, and it is the most connected structure in the limbic system. This is an example of activity in the amygdala In this case, the participants are viewing fearful faces. So the activation is seen here from different orientations, the sagittal, the transverse, and the coronal orientations. And this is actually a PET scan. So as I mentioned before, the amygdala constantly assesses the environment for things that are potentially rewarding and punishing. And although it's also involved in other emotions, its role in fear and anxiety have been the ones that have been mostly researched. An area that is not part of the limbic system proper, but is very important in emotional processing, especially processing of rewards, is the ventral tegmental area. And that is why I wanted to mention it at this point. The VTA, the ventral tegmental area, is a small group of neurons, and it's located in the midbrain. And it targets parts of the brain that are especially involved in reward and pleasure and addictive behavior. One of the targets of the VTA is the nucleus accumbens. Next, I want to talk about the prefrontal cortex. Some researchers don't include the prefrontal cortex as part of the limbic system, but as of recently, it's become almost understood that it is part of the limbic system. The job of the prefrontal cortex is in understanding your own behavior and the consequences of behavior. It also is involved in the executive functions. So the executive functions are planning, prioritizing, and organizing behavior, adapting to change, and also inhibiting behavior that's not appropriate socially. So the prefrontal cortex is the final destination for much of the brain's information about emotion before any actions are taken. And if this part of the brain gets damaged, it limits the person's ability to do executive functioning. It limits their ability to plan and prioritize and organize their behavior, as well as inhibiting behavior that is not appropriate. Another function of the prefrontal cortex is in understanding moral behavior and social rules. So the frontal lobes also seem to have another relation with emotion, and that one is not completely understood right now, but it has been established pretty soundly in research. The activity in the two frontal hemispheres appears to differ for the experience of pleasant and unpleasant emotions. When the individual is experiencing unpleasant emotions, there tends to be more right hemisphere activity in the front than left. And when the individual is experiencing happy emotions, there's more activity in the left frontal side than in the right. This has been studied extensively by a researcher by the name of Richie Davidson and his colleagues. And he has found that if you measure brain activity in terms of EEG or with other imaging methods such as MRI, PET, you will find that the amount of activity differs for the two frontal lobes depending on that individual's experience of mood, whether they're experiencing a positive mood, like a pleasant happiness feeling, or a negative mood. This is not just in humans. This is also something they've noticed in members of other species. So, for example, for dogs, when dogs appear to be especially happy, their tails tend to wag more to the right. Remember that the hemispheres of the brain contralaterally control motor movement. So in other words, the left hemisphere is in control of moving the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere is in control of moving the left side of the body. So if experiencing a happy emotion increases the activity of the left hemisphere for dogs, then it would increase the strength of any processes also controlled by that hemisphere. In this case, the dog's wagging tail. So it wags more to the right because the left hemisphere is more powered than the right during happy emotions. And it would wag more to the left during the experience of negative emotions or fear or anxiety or sadness. So back to Davidson's findings for emotions in the frontal hemispheres in humans, it's not really clear how the activity of the limbic system structures are related to this activity difference between the two hemispheres, but this research is continuing. So there's findings for emotion with not just the frontal hemispheres, but the posterior right and left hemispheres as well. Many years of research have indicated that the posterior, the back part of the right hemisphere, may be more involved in processing emotion stimuli than the left. Now, a caveat has to be mentioned here because these findings only really hold true for individuals who are right-handers, because only right-handers are usually included in neuroscience research because it's really not known how left-handers' brains are organized. So when they decide who's going to be a participant and a subject, if you're a left-hander, then you're usually excluded. So for right-handers, the posterior right hemisphere may be more involved in processing emotional stimuli. But for left-handers, it actually may be very different. But anyway, in this case, research indicates that that right hemisphere, that posterior right hemisphere, may be more specialized to react to and to process emotional stimuli. So one of the sources of evidence that the right hemisphere is more involved in emotion is by looking at individuals' faces. The left side of a person's face usually shows greater emotional expression. And the idea is similar to the wagging tail idea of the dog, and that's that the part of the brain that is more active and more involved in that type of processing will also tend to influence other processing in that hemisphere. In this case, motor processing that influences a person's smile. So if you look at this picture, you'll see if you cover up half the face, one side of her face is a lot more expressive than the other. And this is the case for most people. The left side of their faces usually shows more emotional expression than the right side. And it's thought that that is because the part of their brain that's controlling that side of their face is more specialized for emotion, that posterior right hemisphere. Now, there's clinical data that supports this posterior right hemisphere as being important in processing emotion. Individuals who have right hemisphere damage or right hemisphere lesions are less able to respond and react to the emotional content of things. They have difficulty understanding emotional facial expressions. They also have difficulty understanding emotional tone of voice. And if you have posterior right hemisphere damage, it also has been linked to difficulties in autonomic nervous system responses. The fight or flight response is sometimes not functioning properly if you have right hemisphere damage. So this posterior right hemisphere emotional specialization may be the reason why you will perceive one of these faces as happier and one as sadder or more sad. So which of these faces do you perceive to be happier? And it's easier if you look directly at each face. So I won't tell you which one is typically found to be the happier or the sadder one. The truth is, actually, these two faces are mirror images of each other. So they're really not different. But your brain perceives them as different because one half is projected to your left hemisphere and one half is projected to your right. And the hemisphere that is more involved in processing emotion is the hemisphere that sees the emotion in that face and helps you to determine whether it's a happy face or a sad face. So these two findings, the frontal and the posterior hemispheres as a whole being related to the processing of emotion, are not well understood. Although the limbic system plays a huge role in the processing and the experience of emotion, we now understand that higher neocortical regions, parts of your cortex, also contribute to the processing and the experience of emotion. So the limbic system processes the emotional significance of everything in your world. That includes those structures, that includes the hemispheres as a whole. And the limbic system allows us to experience, to create memories of, and to learn about emotion. Pleasure, pain, joy, depression, euphoria, sadness, anxiety. These complexly arranged nuclei make up many, many feedback loops, and those feedback loops process the emotional significance of everything. And they also add emotional texture to our experiences with the world. So the limbic system is the part of the brain that actually allows us to interact with and not just sense and experience the world. Because it is so important in the experience of our interactions with the world, it's undoubtedly important also in shaping and maintaining our personalities.